train pulled into the station just after 4 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, when the light was beginning to soften and turn the world into something dreamlike. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the platform gradually come into focus. The wooden benches, the flower boxes with their trailing vines, the station master's small office with its painted blue door. She hadn't been home in 7 years. The realization arrived with an odd sort of quiet, the way important things sometimes do, not with fanfare or drama, but with a gentle settling, like a bird finally finding the right branch. 7 years. She could count backwards if she wanted to mark the moments that had accumulated into this particular absence. But instead, she simply gathered her small overnight bag from the overhead rack and stood, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to be gentle with her own body. The platform was nearly empty. A young man in a porter's uniform stood smoking near the station master's office. An elderly woman was being helped down the platform steps by a younger woman who might have been her daughter. Eleanor descended slowly, one hand trailing along the railing, and breathed in the particular smell of this place, a combination of old wood, coal smoke, and something green that might have been the trees beyond the station, or might have simply been her memory of this place, which was, by now, more reliable than her actual perception. The bag was light. She'd packed simply a change of clothes, her toiletries, a book she'd started 3 weeks ago and still hadn't finished. She hadn't been sure what one brought when returning to a place that was no longer quite home, but was still, in some fundamental way, the place where home had been defined. She stood for a moment on the platform, letting the cool air settle around her shoulders. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, and the quality of the light was changing, becoming more golden, more forgiving. The station clock showed 4:17. She had always been exact about times, even as a girl. Her mother used to tease her about it, the way she would glance at clocks and know, within a minute or two, what time it was even without looking. That had been a long time ago. A taxi pulled up near the station entrance, and the driver got out to help the elderly woman with her bags. Eleanor watched this small exchange with interest. The way the driver positioned himself respectfully. The way the younger woman maintained her hold on her mother's arm, while also giving her space to move. It was a dance, Eleanor thought. A careful choreography of dependency and independence that probably didn't have a name, but that everyone eventually learned. She walked toward the taxi, moving slowly but with purpose. The driver saw her and offered a small wave, and Eleanor returned it with a subtle nod of her head. She'd known this driver once. Or rather, she'd known his father, who had run the taxi service in this town for 30 years. This must be the son, then. That would track with the timeline. "Eleanor Hartley?" he asked as she drew close, and something in his voice suggested both question and statement, as though he was offering her the option of being whoever she wanted to be, and simultaneously telling her that he knew who she was. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I'm staying at Millbrook House. You probably remember it. "The old Victorian on Elm Street," he said, opening the passenger door for her. "My mother used to point it out when we drove past. Said it was the most beautiful house in town." Eleanor settled into the back seat, arranging her bag beside her. The taxi smelled of air freshener and something else, something like coffee and old upholstery. It was a comforting smell. "It was beautiful once," Eleanor said softly. "I'm not sure what state it's in now." Driver pulled away from the station smoothly, and Eleanor watched the town reveal itself in the way it always did, block by block, street by street. They passed the old hardware store, still in business, apparently, with fresh paint on its storefront. They passed the bakery where she used to buy bread on Saturday mornings, though it had a different name now. They passed the school building, which looked smaller than she remembered, though of course that wasn't possible. The building was the same. It was Eleanor who had grown and then aged, and whose scale had shifted in ways that made the landmarks of her childhood seem diminished. "From here originally, then?" the driver asked, navigating a turn with easy confidence. "And raised," Eleanor said. "Left when I was 22. Never came back until now. Not until now." Driver didn't push further, and Eleanor appreciated that. Some questions were polite inquiries. Others were invitations to tell a story, and not everyone wanted to hear the story of why a person had stayed away from home for 7 years. The driver seemed to understand this. He simply drove, occasionally pointing out changes that had happened in the town, a new store here, a closed business there. His commentary was gentle and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who loved a place without being sentimental about it. They turned onto Elm Street, and there it was. Millbrook House rose up on the left side of the street exactly as Eleanor had left it, which was to say it rose up both exactly as she had left it and also transformed entirely. The Victorian architecture was unmistakable. The turrets, the wraparound porch, the widow's walk that crowned the 3rd story. But the paint was faded now, a pale gray rather than the bright white she remembered. The gardens were overgrown, wild roses and hydrangeas tangling together in a riot of growth that was neither entirely neglected nor carefully maintained. It existed in some liminal space between 2 states. "Here we are," the driver said, pulling up to the curb. Eleanor sat for a moment without moving, taking it in. The house appeared to be watching her, as though it too had been waiting for 7 years, holding its breath. "It's something," the driver said, and Eleanor heard in his voice a recognition that this was not just a house, not to the woman sitting in the back of his taxi. "Yes," Eleanor said, "it is." She paid the driver, leaving a generous tip, and watched him drive away before turning to face the house. The late afternoon sun was hitting the eastern side, creating shadows in the turrets that made them look like eyes, like the house was truly looking at her. Up close, she could see the details that distance had hidden, the way the paint was peeling in long strips near the gutters, the way several of the Victorian railings on the porch were loose or missing, the way the front steps had settled unevenly over the years. But the front door was painted green, color of a forest, the color Eleanor had chosen herself 43 years ago when she and her husband had first bought the house and spent a glorious summer painting and repairing and filling it with the particular joy of making something your own. That door was still painted green, though the paint was faded now, worn by weather and time. It was like finding an old friend and recognizing her face beneath the lines of age. Eleanor climbed the front steps slowly, testing each one for solidity before putting her full weight on it. The third step creaked but held. Everything held, which was something. She reached out and touched the green door, and the paint was cool and slightly rough beneath her fingers, and the door swung open at her touch, as though it had been waiting for her, had left itself unlocked all these years, trusting that she would eventually come home. The house smelled of old wood and dust, and something floral that might have been potpourri, or might have been the ghost of flowers from long ago. The afternoon light came through the stained glass window above the door, scattering colors across the entrance hall. Red, blue, gold. Eleanor stood in the colored light and felt something in her chest release. A tension she hadn't fully acknowledged had been there. She had come home. Whatever else was true, whatever regrets or sorrows or unfinished business lay in wait within these walls, she had finally done it. She had come home. Part 2. The first evening the house was not abandoned, though it felt close to it. There was furniture in the main rooms, covered with dust cloths that were themselves dusty. There were pictures on the walls, slightly faded by years of sunlight. There were books on the shelves. There was a life here, frozen in time, waiting to be unfrozen. Eleanor moved slowly through the first floor, trailing her hand along the banister, taking in the details. In the sitting room, there was the piano she had learned to play as a girl, its mahogany surface dulled by neglect. In the dining room, the table where she and her husband had hosted countless dinners was bare and empty. In the kitchen, the old stove stood like a monument to a different era, when cooking was a more involved process, more ritual than convenience. She found the bedroom that had been hers as a girl, her parents' room, really, before she'd been born, and then her room after her mother had died, and her father had moved to a smaller bedroom down the hall. The bed was still there, the four-poster bed where she had lain awake countless nights, listening to the house settle around her, thinking thoughts that seemed important at the time, and that she could no longer quite remember. Above the dresser, there was a mirror. Eleanor approached it slowly, and the woman looking back at her was, as always, both familiar and strange. Her face had changed, of course. The years had been written across it in ways that couldn't be undone. But her eyes were the same, dark gray, with a particular intensity that had been remarked upon since she was a child. Those eyes had always given her away, revealed what she was thinking, what she was feeling, what she was trying to hide. She turned away from the mirror before she could read too much in that gaze. The kitchen, when she ventured into it, proved to be more functional than she'd expected. There was a tea kettle on the stove. A dent in its side suggested it had been used recently. There was food in the pantry, canned goods mostly, but also tea and coffee, and a jar of honey that had crystallized over time. Someone had been maintaining the house, or rather, someone had been maintaining the minimum necessary to keep it from falling entirely into disrepair. There were no fresh supplies, nothing that suggested active habitation, but there was enough. Eleanor filled the kettle with water and put it on the stove, then waited for it to boil, watching the fire catch and hold. The kitchen was in the back of the house, and through the window, she could see the garden beyond what had been the garden anyway. Now it was a wild tangle of vegetation. Roses had grown into the trees. Vines covered what had once been a gazebo. Everything had been consumed by growth, returned to nature, allowed to become something wild. It was beautiful, in its way. The water boiled, and Eleanor made herself a cup of tea, plain tea. Nothing fancy, just water and a tea bag that she found in the pantry. She carried it to the sitting room and settled into the chair that had been her father's favorite back when she was a girl, and he would sit in this chair to read the newspaper and listen to the radio. The chair held the shape of him, or perhaps it just held the shape of sitting, of time, of all the people who had sat here across the years and worn their slight impressions into the fabric. Eleanor shifted slightly, trying to find a comfortable position, and wondered if she could still feel him in the chair, or if that was just her imagination, looking for presence in absence. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth settle into her. Outside, the light was continuing its descent toward evening. Soon it would be dark. Soon night would fill the house, and she would be alone in a place that was filled with the presence of people who were no longer here. The thought should have been frightening. Instead, it felt peaceful. She closed her eyes and listened to the house around her, the small creaks and shifts that old buildings make, the wind in the eaves, the distant sound of a neighbor's television. These sounds had been the backdrop to her childhood, the white noise of her formative years. How strange that she could still recognize them, still find them comforting, even after 7 years away, even after a lifetime away, perhaps, because she realized, as she sat in her father's chair and drank tea in the gathering dusk, that she had been away not just for 7 years, but for something much longer. She had been away from this place even when she was living here, even when she was a girl in this house, learning its rhythms, memorizing its particular geography. She had been preparing to leave. She had been storing up resentment and small rebellions like fuel for the day when she could finally escape. And she had escaped. She had left when she was 22 with a suitcase and a determination to never return. She had made a life somewhere else, built a career, married, divorced, traveled, created memories in other places. She had been successful in the ways that the world measures success. And yet, here she was, back in her father's chair, drinking tea in the house she'd been so desperate to leave. Life was stranger than any story, she thought. More elaborate in its ironies, more complex in its cycles. Part 3. The night of letters, Eleanor didn't sleep that first night. She had expected she might not. Old houses were full of unfamiliar sounds, and sleep was already becoming a more uncertain proposition with age. But she had hoped. Instead, she lay in the guest room it had felt wrong to sleep in her childhood bed, to layer her adult self over that younger version, and listened to the house breathe around her toward midnight. Unable to lie still any longer, she got up and went downstairs. She took a lamp with her, one of the old electric lamps from the hallway, and made her way to her father's study. This room was in the front of the house, a small, book-lined space with a heavy wooden desk and a leather chair that had cracked with age. Behind the desk was a painting, a portrait of her mother, done by a local artist when Eleanor's mother was 37 years old. She was wearing a blue dress, and her hand was resting against her throat in a way that suggested thoughtfulness, or perhaps concern. Eleanor sat at the desk, her father's desk, though by now it was just a piece of furniture, no longer belonging to anyone, and opened the drawers. She was not searching for anything in particular. She was simply allowing herself to look, to remember, to piece together the archaeology of a life that had been lived in this house before she had come in the bottom drawer. Underneath some old ledgers, she found letters. There were at least 100 of them, tied together with a faded ribbon, the envelopes yellowed with age. Eleanor carefully untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The handwriting was familiar, her mother's careful script. The letters formed with a precision that suggested someone trained in penmanship. The letter was dated 1947. Eleanor's mother would have been 28 years old. Eleanor herself had been born in 1951, so these were letters from before Eleanor existed, from the early years of her parents' marriage. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began, "I miss you so much it feels like missing a piece of myself. How is the work going? Are you eating enough? I worry that you don't eat properly when I'm not there to make sure." Eleanor read the letter slowly, carefully, aware that she was trespassing on an intimate conversation between people who were no longer alive to object. Her mother writing to her father presumably reading these letters over and over again, keeping them safe, returning them to his desk drawer where they would wait to be found. She read another. Then another. Her parents' courtship unfolded through these letters, a love story written in her mother's careful hand. The early passions, the small quarrels, the reconciliations, the dreams they had, the fears, the mundane details of life, what her mother had eaten for breakfast, what her father had done in the garden, the way a neighbor had been difficult, the way the church service had moved them both. Eleanor found herself crying without quite knowing when the tears had started. She was reading the words of her mother, dead for 35 years now. She was hearing her mother's voice, the particular cadence and concern that had defined their relationship, until Eleanor had been old enough to resent it. There was a letter from 1951, the year Eleanor was born. "Thomas, she is perfect. I have never seen anything so perfect. Her fingers are so tiny, and she has your chin, I think, though it's hard to tell yet. I am terrified I will break her. I am terrified I am not good enough to be her mother. How did you know you would be a good father? How did you have such confidence? Eleanor set that letter down and put her face in her hands. Her mother had been afraid too. Her mother, who had seemed so certain, so capable, had been terrified. Terrified of being inadequate, of failing. Eleanor had never known this about her mother. She had only known that her mother pushed, that she insisted on excellence, that she seemed to expect greatness from Eleanor in a way that made it clear Eleanor's ordinary achievements were never quite enough. But reading these letters, Eleanor could see that it had all been fear. All of it. Her mother's intensity had come from fear that she wasn't doing enough, wasn't doing it right, wasn't being the mother her daughter deserved. Eleanor read for hours. She read about her parents' marriage, about their hopes and doubts, and daily rituals. She read about the pregnancy that had killed her mother. Eleanor hadn't known all the details, had never wanted to ask. But here in these letters, she found that her mother had been pregnant again when Eleanor was 4 years old. The baby had come too early. Complications. Her mother had hemorrhaged. There were letters her father had written in those final days. Letters that had apparently never been sent, but that had been found among his papers after his own death. He was writing to his wife, writing as though she could still read them, telling her how much he needed her, how much their daughter needed her. The anguish in those words was so raw that Eleanor had to set them down, had to step away from the desk. Her father had kept these letters for decades. He had read them, presumably, in his grief. He had held onto them as a way of maintaining a connection with a woman who had been gone for so long. And then, when he died, Eleanor had inherited them, though she had never claimed them, never acknowledged them, until now. Eleanor sat at the desk as the night deepened around her, and she thought about all the ways her father had tried to tell her about her mother, all the times he must have wanted to share these letters with her, to help her understand the woman who had raised her until Eleanor was 4 years old, and then had to let go. But Eleanor had made it clear, in the way of adolescents and young adults, that she wasn't interested in her father's memories. She had dismissed his reminiscences as the sentimental ramblings of a grieving man. She had built a wall between herself and her father's sorrow, and her father, respecting that wall, or simply not knowing how to breach it, had stopped trying. By the time Eleanor was